What would be your advice for the Republican leadership, knowing that John Thune promised Democrats a floor vote? The House is in question.
Yeah. So I think Senator Thune, Leader Thune, is certainly going to fulfill that commitment. I think we know that agreement, which is just a major extension of it, won't go forward. In the House, I think they're frustrated because those 8 weeks of the shutdown wasted the time to be able to do the negotiations. So the clock's ticking, it's moving very quickly.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure they're going to hit that number. There's a lot of work being done about how do we address this. Clearly, the COVID pandemic is over. It's time to really go back to some normalcy here. That health care within the Affordable Care Act is just broken. It is expensive. It's not necessarily good health care. It is going up to people making $500,000 a year. There's a lot of imaginary accounts. 40% have never filed a claim. There's a lot of problems. So they're trying to figure out. So what are the key asks? In trying to reform this in a better way. And try to do it in that timetable, Joe. I think it's going to be hard.
It's going to be tough. We've got funding running out potentially January 30. Do you worry that this leads to another shutdown?
That one I don't. I think they can get it done by the 30th. But there's similar dynamics to what we just went through will be occurring at the end of January.
Yeah, nothing's really changed actually here, right?
Yeah, really. It is Groundhog Day, just 2 months later. But I don't know anyone. Certainly on the Republican side, who thinks it's smart to shut down the government. They're working hard.
Well, in your view, just lastly on this, before we open our conversation to trade, should this be a reform of Obamacare or a replace of Obamacare?
No, it's going to be a reform.
Yeah.
But this is a program that's really ingratiated itself.
The roots run deep.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a huge prospecting for making it dramatically better, and certainly for taxpayers and the people getting the health care.
Well, we're going to talk about the USMCA here. Your involvement has been deliberate as you're actually working to promote the renegotiation of this deal here. It's a mandatory review. How much of this needs to, in fact, be renegotiated versus renewed?
I think the original premise, having worked with President Trump and negotiators, I led the House effort to secure passage. It really was sort of a check-in. How we doing? Is it being implemented? Is it being enforced? Where do we strengthen? To where the president, as likes to bring other projects and other ideas into these conversations. But at the end of the day, for the president, this is the gold standard of trade agreements for America. Certainly the most consequential we have. It's already proven to make America, because of the relationship with Canada and Mexico, in a really smart design. Zero tariffs, near zero barriers, all integrated. That has made the U.S. more secure, economically much more stronger. And as we look to China, allows us to be far more competitive in the future against that threat. So this is an important, the review and the beginning of it, very important step to preserving this agreement.
All right, so you set the stage. Now let's do something no one else would do. We bring in the two gentlemen, as we mentioned, who negotiated the original USMCA. They're with us in studio right now. Ken Smith Ramos, Office of the Secretariat of the Economy, partner at Agon, former Mexican chief negotiator. It's great to have you with us. And Steve Verheul, Special Advisor for Trade Policy to Canada's Deputy Minister of Finance. When you negotiated this originally, it's great to meet both of you, and thank you for being part of our conversation. Steve, I'm going to start with you here. When will we have a pathway, a timeline for negotiations?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that we necessarily will.
Yeah.
I think that there's certainly a timeline in the agreement about how the review should conclude by July 1st. All three countries have to commit in writing that they want the agreement to continue. But the process before that is not spelled out. And I think we'll be waiting to see how the U.S. wants to move and how quickly, because I think it'll be in their corner just to get the ball rolling.
Interesting. With that said, do you worry that the administration is not focused on this?
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for the invitation. Well, We know that for Mexico, for Canada, hopefully for the United States, there's a realization of the value that USMCA brings to the economies of all three countries. This is an agreement that is worth $2 trillion for the three North American countries. Just between Mexico and the U.S., we're talking about $900 billion in trade. Wow. And the U.S. is the #1 investor in Mexico. Canada's #3. And so this is a priority, a very strong priority for President Sheinbaum to preserve the trade agreement. So part of the objective in this context that we're living through right now with the tariffs that Mexico and Canada are also facing, the Mexican government has been trying to negotiate its way out of these tariffs that we're facing, clearing the deck and making sure that we can have a constructive review of the agreement so that it gets extended for another 16 years as is established in the USMCA. Hopefully that the US, Mexico, and Canada will come together to maintain a trilateral agreement. That is certainly the hope of the Mexican government and certainly the Mexican private sector as well.
You use the word preserve, which I'm going to believe is intentional. Do we worry that there will be no renewal or no renegotiation? Is there a possibility that the USMCA goes away?
It's possible. The U.S. could withdraw from the agreement. There is a provision for that, as there is in most trade agreements. I think it'll be more likely that we'll do something with the review, but if the U.S. does not sign on for an extension on July 1st, then we're into annual reviews, but the agreement itself continues for another 10 years. So we may be in a continuing uncertain environment.
Is that a strategy for this administration? You guys have been through this before. You withdraw only to gain leverage by coming back in. How do you frame the administration's ambitions here?
Well, in the original negotiation, we had several instances when President Trump threatened to pull out of the NAFTA. However, this time around, what we see is a situation where perhaps the U.S. will use the leverage of the tariffs that are being imposed on Mexico and Canada during the USMCA discussions. As was mentioned, this is not an automatic renegotiation. Right. It can be at the level of an administrative review where the three countries analyze how to improve the implementation of an agreement which is clearly successful. It's promoting investment and trade in North America. And at the end of the day, the best way for North America to compete successfully with the rest of the world, especially with China, is to eliminate as much as we can any of the trade barriers between the three countries. So yes, there will be tough moments during the review. I'm sure strategies that are used to generate pressure on Mexico and Canada. But at the end of the day, I think that cooler heads will prevail and that we'll have not only the preservation of the agreement, but the opportunity to lay the groundwork to continue strengthening North American economic integration. That should be the goal of the three countries.
A lot has evolved since the original agreement was made. When you think about digital technologies, artificial intelligence, even more specifically, and some of these have come into play with talks between the administration and Canada directly. How much will that be something to figure out in these negotiations that might not have been addressed in the first version?
Yes, I think that's certainly an area where we could spend a fair amount of time on. And I think that puts us in the right kind of orientation. Where can we improve the agreement and modernize it to some degree? And I think there are other areas we could do that with as well, particularly the economic security questions, relations with China, all of that. And I think that puts us on a much better path than trying to have differences between us. We should be looking at the outside pressures we face.
Let's bring Kevin Brady back into the conversation here. Congressman, there's been a lot of noise around trade with this administration, and I think we could agree that there's been some bad blood created, maybe more when it comes to Canada than Mexico. I just wonder, do these two nations have similar or different approaches to dealing with this based on what we've learned in the last year?
I'd say a little different. Mainly because President Trump tends to have relationships based on personal relationships with other world leaders, and that tends to be different from country to country. But I'll tell you that the most fascinating fact about this agreement that most Americans don't think about is because of this agreement, Mexico and Canada are now Americas together. They are our largest investor, our largest customer, and our most important supplier. And they have made a commitment to the U.S. and frankly, President Trump's goals that no other nation, no other region can hope to approach. So it's going to be critical, I think, to preserve the agreement, to strengthen it. And we want that long-term certainty because we've got those outside risks from China, other foreign competitors. Mexico and Canada can help us meet and win, those economic challenges.
Common ground here. Let's talk about this with each of you specifically. Ken, Claudia Sheinbaum is coming to Washington. It's been noted that she has been a bit of a Trump whisperer, if you will, has managed to figure out how to use this relationship to the benefit of Mexico and maybe head off some issues. Is she coming here specifically for USMCA?
Well, the reason specifically has to do with the World Cup draw that's coming up. It's a wonderful opportunity next year to bring the three countries together and the world together.
So she'll be at the FIFA draw on Friday.
So hopefully, we haven't heard the confirmation as of yet, but we believe that's what will happen. Mm-hmm. But it's also a great opportunity, if possible, perhaps to meet with President Trump. I think that the Mexican government's approach to finding spaces for dialogue and negotiation with President Trump have worked well so far. The efforts to try to eliminate the tariffs that we have against Mexico have not been successful so far, but I think that it has laid the groundwork for possible agreements on that end. Mm-hmm. To the degree that we're able to get rid of these tariffs that we have in front of us and to set up a conversation around the USMCA based on future free trade without managed trade, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, etc., the region will be better served. So I think that's part of the objective. I think there is a good relationship between both heads of state, and hopefully that can lead to actual concrete results of getting rid of the tariffs and strengthening our agreement as we go forward.
Steve, we only have about a minute left, and I don't want to cut you off, but I'd love to hear from you more on how this negotiation might solve the tension between our two countries.
Well, I think the tension comes and goes. I think actually Prime Minister Carney seems to get along quite well with President Trump, but that hasn't translated into anything more concrete beyond good conversations. So we're hoping that we'll find a way to get on a better track and make some progress from here.